He couldn't pay for his haircut, and they humiliated him in front of everyone. They laughed as if he were just a beggar. No one said a word in his defense. A veteran who gave his life for his country stood with his head down as he was chased away like a homeless person. To everyone, he was a nobody. And only by chance did it become known who he really was. Too late. Unjust, or just. If it feels wrong to you, write down your opinion in the comments. Walter Jennings had learned to live small. His apartment sat on the edge of town, tucked behind a rusted laundromat and a liquor store that hadn't changed its neon sign since the 80s. Inside, the wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the radiator coughed more than it heated. But it was his. Quiet, broken, and still, like him. Each morning, he rose at 5. Old habits from the military never died, even when no one was waiting for you. He boiled water for instant coffee, fed his aging Labrador mix, Daisy, and dressed with care, as if someone might still notice. The trousers were always pressed. The boots always shined. Even if the soles had long since thinned. On Wednesdays, he walked 2 miles to the food pantry. Not because he wanted to, but because the pension he received barely kept the lights on. It wasn't the hunger that stung, but the way people avoided looking at him, as if his worn coat and quiet presence carried shame. Yet Walter never cursed the world. Not aloud. He still helped when he could, patching up a neighbor's fence with old nails he'd salvaged, helping an elderly woman carry her groceries up the steps, guiding a lost boy back to his mother after school. This morning, he'd spent an hour helping a teenage mechanic whose car had stalled near the curb. The kid was flustered, tools in the wrong places, cursing more than he tightened bolts. "You're flooding the engine," Walter had said calmly, crouching beside him. "Turn the key while I hold the choke." The engine sputtered, then roared to life. The boy had stared at him in disbelief. "How'd you?" "Old habits," Walter muttered, brushing off his hands. He waved off the thanks. It was enough to see the car moving again. That afternoon, as the sun dipped lower and the shadows lengthened, Walter stood in front of the small barbershop on 5th and Lenox. He ran a hand over the side of his head, gray, grown out, and uneven. The last time he'd had a proper haircut was before winter. He'd been meaning to go for weeks. The inside was warm and bright. Posters of trendy cuts lined the wall, and the smell of aftershave and talcum powder filled the air. "Afternoon," Walter said gently, stepping in. The barber, a man in his 30s with slick-back hair and a chain around his neck, glanced at him over a football game playing on a wall-mounted TV. "Walk-ins." The barber nodded. "Cash only." Walter reached into his coat pocket, thumbing through the folded bills he'd saved. He paused. His fingers stiffened. He was short, maybe by a few dollars. He didn't say anything right away. Just stood there, trying to decide whether to turn around quietly or ask if the men would let it slide, just this once. Then he smiled to himself and said, almost apologetically, "I think I'm a little short today. I'll come back." "You serious?" The barber cut in loudly, looking around to the others in the room, a teenager scrolling his phone, an older man reading a paper. "You come in here with no money?" Walter tried to speak, but the barber had already turned his voice up. "You think I cut hair for free? This ain't a charity, old man." The air thickened. Walter didn't argue. He didn't yell. He just touched the brim of his cap, an old habit, muscle memory from a life that once required salute, and turned for the door. No one stopped him. Not even the boy whose engine he had fixed that morning, now seated quietly in the back of the shop, looking at his shoes. Walter stepped into the cool air and pulled his coat tighter. The next morning, the town was busy with weekend bustle, markets opening, school fundraisers setting up tables, and the corner bakery piping out the scent of fresh bread. But Walter walked through it all like a ghost. He hadn't slept well. Daisy had curled beside his bed, sensing something in the silence that hung too heavy. Walter had stared at the ceiling until dawn. The echo of the barber's voice, "This ain't a charity, old man," rattled through his skull like a ricochet. Still, the day had to be faced. The pantry would be distributing canned goods and old produce near the church on Main Street, and Walter needed dog food. That was his excuse. He never said it was for himself. As he reached the line outside the church, he nodded at the usual faces. Miss Clara from the bus stop. Benny, the mute janitor who always gave him half a smile. None of them spoke much, they all lived on the same edge of invisibility. A volunteer in a red apron handed out tickets. Walter took one and stepped into the slow shuffle of bodies toward the folding tables. That's when he heard it. "Isn't that the guy who got tossed out of the barber's yesterday?" The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the morning like a broken bottle. Walter didn't turn around. But he felt it, the sudden stillness, the shift in air, like a match had been struck behind his back. "Yeah, I saw him. Didn't have money. Just stood there like a fool." Snickers. Not loud. But sharp. Dismissive. Worse than shouting. Walter stared at his boots, cracked at the toes, soles nearly worn through. The line moved forward. So did he. When it was his turn, he reached for a sack of potatoes, but the young woman behind the table hesitated. She looked at his coat, his face, and then at the supervisor behind her. Something passed between them. "I'm sorry," she said stiffly. "We're limiting items today." She took the bag from his hands and replaced it with a single can of beans. Walter didn't argue. He offered a soft nod and took the can, placing it carefully into his canvas bag beside a dented tin of soup and a box of stale crackers. As he walked away, the laughter returned, not harsh or obvious, but behind hands, behind backs. And no one said anything. Not Miss Clara. Not Benny. Not even the older men from the barbershop yesterday, now sitting on the church steps with a sandwich. Walter's face didn't change. But his pace slowed. His shoulders, already curved by time, seemed to fold in further. If he had shouted back, they might have understood. But he only lowered his head. He walked 4 blocks with the bag cutting into his hand and the world suddenly smaller than it had ever felt. The town he had once protected, the one whose map he could still trace in memory from his years in uniform, had no room for him now. On his way home, a child accidentally let go of a balloon. It floated up, twisting against the sky. Walter stopped and watched it disappear into the clouds. He stood there a moment too long, as if considering whether to follow it. Then he turned the corner toward home. At the door, Daisy greeted him with gentle eyes and a tail that wagged without condition. Walter dropped the bag inside, gave her a pat, and sat on the front step, watching the street. Nobody waved. Nobody stopped. His hair was still overgrown, curling at the ears. He ran a hand through it. It didn't matter now. He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded letter addressed in faded ink, something he hadn't touched in years, and reread it slowly. From someone who once called him Captain. That night, as the town moved on without him, Walter sat in the dim light of his living room, medals still tucked away in a drawer that no one ever opened. Tomorrow would be the same. Or maybe not. The wind picked up that evening, brushing dry leaves against the window of Walter's apartment like soft knuckles asking to be let in. Inside, all was still except for the quiet shuffle of his old slippers on the wooden floor and Daisy's gentle snoring near the heater. Walter stood in front of the small cabinet by the wall. Its top drawer stuck slightly, always had. With a practiced tug, it gave way, revealing a box wrapped in an old army green towel. He placed it on the table and sat down. The metal creaked under his weight. His back ached from the long walk, and his hands still carried the sting from the rough-cut handles of the canvas bag. Slowly, he unfolded the towel. Inside were the pieces of a life no one else had seen. A bronze star, the edges dulled with age. A patch from the 7th Infantry Division. A letter with coffee-stained corners from a soldier named Harris, one of the young ones who never made it home. Walter ran his finger across the metal. It used to shine. Once, people had clapped when he stepped off a plane in uniform. They had cheered in airports, offered handshakes in diners. But time is cruel, and memory fades when there are no cameras, no headlines, no witness left to tell the story. He opened the letter again. Captain Jennings. Still can't believe we made it out of that canyon. I saw what you did. You saved us. You'll probably never accept credit, but I want you to know, you're the reason I ever saw my daughter again. I owe you more than I can ever repay. Harris had died 3 weeks after mailing it, roadside IED. Walter had read the letter every year on that date. This year, he'd forgotten. He placed the letter beside the medal and turned to the photo album. Page after page of faces stared back at him. Some grinning with mud-streaked helmets. Others posing with arms slung over shoulders in makeshift bases. Walter had labeled them all. Names. Places. Dates. But there were fewer photos toward the end. The last page was blank, save for one image, a black and white snapshot of a much younger Walter in his Class A uniform, standing next to a general who had since passed away. Walter stared at it a long while. The battles he fought never made headlines. But they shaped nations. He once negotiated an evacuation through a mountain pass under fire, saving dozens. Another time, he carried a wounded radio operator for 3 miles after an ambush. But those stories lived only in the mouths of dead men and the paperwork filed away in forgotten cabinets. He sighed and glanced at the medal. Then, almost impulsively, he reached for an envelope. He placed the bronze star inside, along with Harris's letter, and sealed it shut. He wrote no return address. Only a name. To the boy in the back of the shop. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because the boy had looked away. Maybe because something in his face said he wasn't proud of that. Walter set the envelope aside and leaned back in his chair. Daisy came over, placing her head gently on his knee. He stroked her ears and looked out the window at the night descending over the city. The world had moved on, sure. But part of him still remembered the code he lived by, to serve quietly, to endure silently, and to never believe that dignity had to be loud to be real. There was no parade for men like him. No monuments. Just quiet apartments, worn slippers, and a drawer filled with truth the world forgot. Still, Walter believed in something larger than bitterness. Even now. Especially now. And somewhere in the distance, he heard the faint echo of marching boots and helicopters cutting through dust, memories layered like smoke over the silence. He closed the album, stood, and turned off the lamp. Tomorrow, he would rise early again. Because it was what he knew. 3 mornings later, the town awoke to something unfamiliar, the low rumble of engines that didn't belong to delivery vans or garbage trucks. A black SUV rolled slowly down Main Street, its windows tinted and its license plates marked with a small emblem, a golden eagle clutching arrows. Behind it followed a sleek military sedan with 2 uniformed officers seated inside. The convoy stopped in front of the barbershop on 5th and Lenox. At first, no one paid much attention. The barista across the street glanced out while foaming milk. An old man on a bench raised an eyebrow. But then, a photographer stepped out of the SUV. Then another man, tall, crisply dressed, wearing a ceremonial military dress uniform adorned with silver trim, exited the second vehicle and opened the trunk. He pulled out a large, framed photo. Inside the barbershop, the same barber who had ridiculed Walter paused mid-sentence. He watched as the officer carried the frame across the sidewalk and rested it gently against the window facing the street. It was a portrait, black and white, of Walter Jennings in uniform. Clean-shaven, eyes forward, a metal pin to his chest. Beneath the image, bold letters read, "Hero of our city, Colonel Walter H. Jennings." The street fell into silence. People stopped. Phones came out. Someone whispered, "That's the guy from the food line, the one they laughed at." Another voice, "Didn't he get kicked out of here?" The barber stepped outside, mouth dry. His hand twitched slightly as he lit a cigarette he didn't finish. The officer turned toward him. "You know this man?" he asked, voice calm, direct. The barber nodded faintly. "This establishment is one of 3 chosen to display this city's newest recognition of service. Colonel Jennings served 35 years in the Army. Multiple combat zones. 2 Distinguished Service Crosses. Bronze Star. Saved over 40 lives during a hostage crisis in Kandahar. Retired with full honors. He paused, letting it settle. He lived here. Among you. Quietly. Until recently, unrecognized. The crowd had grown. Teenagers, store clerks, even the mayor's aide from City Hall stood frozen. A woman from the church covered her mouth with her hand. The boy from the back of the barbershop, the same one whose car Walter had helped fix, stepped forward. His face was pale. I didn't know, he muttered. The officer nodded once. That's the thing about real heroes. They don't wear signs. A camera clicked. The photographer snapped a shot of the photo now gleaming in the shop window. Up the street, at Walter's apartment, the knocks came gently. Walter opened the door in his worn cardigan. Daisy padded behind him. His face was calm, unreadable, as the officer saluted. Colonel Jennings, sir. The city would like to recognize your service. You are invited to receive honors today, if you'll allow it. Walter looked past him, down the sidewalk at the gathering crowd. Then back at the letter in the officer's hand. He said nothing for a moment. Then offered a faint smile. I never left for the medals, he said quietly. But I suppose it's time to wear them again. Back at the barbershop, the buzz grew louder. Local news had arrived. A small podium was set up. The mayor emerged, tugging his blazer into place, flanked by 2 aides holding scripts they didn't need. The crowd parted as a military vehicle pulled up, and Walter stepped out. He wore his dress blues. The same ones from the old photograph. They no longer fit perfectly, but the creases held. Medals lined his chest. His chin was high. His eyes, steady. Gasps. Silence. Recognition. Do you know who walks among you? A woman whispered to her daughter. People began to applaud. First slowly, then rising into something fuller, deeper, not the cheer for a parade, but the sound of realization. Of regret. Even the barber clapped, awkwardly, painfully, before lowering his hands. Walter looked out at the faces. Some familiar. Some not. All changed. He nodded once and raised his hand in quiet greeting. No bitterness. Just presence. Just truth. The town square had never felt so still. Walter stood at the podium, the sun catching on the dull shine of his medals, long hidden, now exposed like old wounds finally given light. The breeze tugged gently at his coat, and his hat rested in his hand. Behind him, 2 flags waved, one for the country, one for the state. Both lowered to half-mast during the ceremony. The mayor stepped forward first. We are gathered here today, he began, his voice tremulous with the weight of public guilt, to honor a man who walked our streets unnoticed, whose service to this nation was hidden behind worn clothes and a quiet presence. But not anymore. He turned toward Walter and extended a velvet box, inside, a newly minted City Medal of Honor. Walter accepted it, not with pomp, but with a steady nod. Then, one by one, others approached. A woman from the school board offered flowers. A boy from the grocery store offered a drawing, crayons on rough paper, a soldier with a flag. Even Benny, the mute janitor, came forward with a single salute, hand trembling, eyes wet. But it was the moment the soldiers arrived that stilled even the wind. A platoon in formal uniform marched into the square, boots hitting pavement in perfect rhythm. At their head was a young officer, a captain barely 30, eyes sharp with pride. As the unit halted before Walter, they raised their hands in synchronized salute. Not for show. Not out of duty. But out of reverence. Walter, stunned for the first time all day, slowly returned the salute. His hand was slower, aged by time, but it did not shake. The young officer stepped forward. Sir, my father served under you. He always told me, if you ever meet Colonel Jennings, you stand tall. You don't blink. You thank him. Walter's lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, He reached into his coat pocket and removed the envelope he'd sealed days earlier. He handed it to the young man. "For someone who should remember," he said softly. Across the crowd, the silence gave way to whispers, not of mockery, but of realization. People nudged each other. The barber stood near the back, his arms crossed, eyes lowered. The same men who had laughed at Walter now couldn't bear to meet his gaze. But Walter never looked toward him. Never called attention to the shame. He had no desire for revenge. Only to move forward. He spoke, finally, into the microphone. His voice was steady. Quiet, but it carried. "I lived among you. I passed by you. Some of you passed by me, too. That's all right. I was trained to endure silence as much as battle." He paused. "We all fight unseen battles. I hold no anger in my heart." That line hit harder than any accusation. A woman sobbed near the front. A child reached for her hand. The mayor wiped his eyes with a folded napkin. Walter continued, "I didn't want applause. I didn't need handouts. I only wanted to serve, and after the uniform was folded for the last time, to still matter. That's all any of us want." He looked out over the crowd, many of whom couldn't meet his gaze. "But today," he added, "you gave something back. Not to me, but to what I stood for. And for that, I thank you." He stepped away from the microphone. A military bugler began playing taps from the far end of the square. Heads bowed. Some hands reached hearts. A veteran in a wheelchair saluted through tears. And Walter, still, dignified, stood tall. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence was enough. His story, now visible. His silence, finally understood. The sun dipped low as the crowd dispersed, leaving behind folded chairs, footprints in the dust, and a silence that felt reverent rather than empty. Walter rode home in the same military sedan that brought him to the square. He sat quietly in the back, Daisy's leash wrapped around his hand, though the dog had stayed behind at a neighbor's for the day. The officer who drove said little, only offering a nod when they reached his street. As Walter stepped out, something caught his eye. His porch had been swept. A new welcome mat lay at the door. A basket of bread and canned goods rested beside it, wrapped in twine. Someone had left a note. "Thank you. We didn't see you before. We do now." He stood still for a long moment, then picked up the basket and stepped inside. The apartment hadn't changed, but it felt lighter somehow, as if the dust had finally stopped settling. He placed his medals back in the drawer, but left the framed photo, the one from the ceremony, propped on the mantel. Later, as the sky turned a golden orange, Walter sat on the porch with Daisy curled beside him. Her head rested on his boot. He sipped a warm mug of tea, his hands steady. Across the street, the boy from the barbershop walked by with a backpack slung over his shoulder. He paused, awkward, then raised a hand in a tentative salute. Walter returned it without a word. Further down, a little girl on a bicycle waved as she passed. 2 houses over, an alderman lowered his newspaper and nodded. Walter didn't need applause. He didn't need speeches. He had his silence back, but now it carried dignity, not loneliness. He looked out toward the horizon, where the last of the light kissed the rooftops and the breeze turned soft as memory. Daisy stirred in her sleep. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes sang a gentle note. He smiled, faint and full.